The dust kicked up by the stagecoach wheels had barely settled when Thomas McKenna first laid eyes on her. Sarah stood on the wooden platform of Willow Creek's modest train station, a vision in simple brown wool, her hands folded neatly in front of her traveling bag. She was nothing like the painted ladies who frequented the saloons, nor the boisterous farmwives who dominated the town's social gatherings. There was something ethereal about her, something that made Thomas forget to breathe for a moment as he approached with his hat in his hands. "Miss Sarah Whitmore?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The correspondence had been brief, arranged through a matrimonial agency back east. A quiet woman seeking a new life, a rancher needing a wife. Simple enough? Or so he'd thought. She nodded, her green eyes meeting his for just a moment before dropping to study the weathered planks beneath her feet. "Mr. McKenna." Her voice was barely above a whisper, carried away by the desert wind that swept through the valley. Thomas had built his ranch from nothing, carved it out of the unforgiving Arizona territory with his own 2 hands and the sweat of his brow. At 35, he was tired of eating beans from a can and mending his own shirts. He needed a wife, someone to share the burden of frontier life, someone to fill the silence that echoed through his cabin at night. The matrimonial agency had promised him a suitable match, a woman of good character, seeking the same practical arrangement. But as he loaded Sarah's single trunk into his wagon, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this quiet bride than met the eye. She moved with a careful precision, as if every gesture was calculated, every word weighed before it left her lips. When he helped her up onto the wagon seat, her hand trembled in his, and he noticed the way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the desert heat. The ride to his ranch took them through 20 miles of scrub brush and red rock formations that jutted from the earth like ancient monuments. Thomas tried to make conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the cattle operation he'd built, but Sarah's responses were monosyllabic, her attention focused on the trail behind them rather than the path ahead. "You'll like it here," he said, as they crested the hill that revealed his spread below. The ranch house was modest but sturdy, built from local stone and timber he'd hauled down from the mountains. Corrals stretched out behind the house, and his small herd of cattle dotted the pasture beyond. It's peaceful, quiet, good place for a person to start over. Sarah's grip tightened on the wagon seat. "Start over," she repeated, as if testing the words. "Yes, I suppose it is. Hey there, friend. Before we continue with Sarah and Thomas's story, I'd love for you to hit that subscribe button if you're enjoying this tale from the Old West. And tell me, in the comments, what city are you watching from? I love hearing from folks all over the world who enjoy these frontier stories. Now, the wedding ceremony took place that very evening in the parlor of Thomas's ranch house. Reverend Morrison had ridden out from town, a weathered man who'd seen enough frontier marriages to know that love was a luxury most couldn't afford. The vows were simple, practical words, spoken in the flickering light of oil lamps, while the desert wind howled outside like a restless spirit. Sarah wore the same brown dress she'd traveled in, her hair pinned back severely, her face pale as moonlight. When Thomas slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, he felt her hand shake again, that same tremor he'd noticed at the station. She spoke her vows in that whisper-soft voice, promising to honor and obey, but her eyes remained fixed on the window, watching the darkness beyond the glass. After the Reverend left, Thomas showed Sarah to the bedroom he'd prepared for her. He'd spent weeks getting it ready, buying new curtains from the general store and even splurging on a mirror with a carved wooden frame. "I'll be sleeping in the barn tonight," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "Give you time to settle in. Get comfortable." Sarah turned to face him then, and for a moment, something flickered in her green eyes. Gratitude, perhaps, or relief. "Thank you," she said. "You're very kind." Thomas nodded and closed the door, leaving her alone with whatever secrets she carried. He made his way to the barn, spreading his bedroll in the hayloft, where he could hear the gentle sounds of his horses settling in for the night. It wasn't the wedding night he'd imagined. But then again, this wasn't a marriage born of romance. It was a business arrangement, a practical solution to practical problems. But as he lay there, staring up at the barn rafters, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the way Sarah had looked at him during the ceremony, as if she were memorizing his face, as if she were saying goodbye. The next morning, Thomas woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting from the house. He found Sarah in the kitchen, moving efficiently between the stove and the table, her hair neatly braided and her sleeves rolled up to reveal slender but capable arms. She'd prepared a feast by frontier standards: eggs, bacon, biscuits, and gravy that smelled like heaven after months of his own poor cooking. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, settling into his chair at the rough-hewn table. "A wife should earn her keep," Sarah replied, not meeting his eyes as she poured his coffee. Her movements were precise, economical, as if she'd done this 1,000 times before. Over the following days, Sarah proved herself to be everything Thomas had hoped for in a wife. She cooked, cleaned, mended his clothes, and tended a small garden behind the house with the dedication of someone who understood the value of hard work. She spoke little, but her presence filled the cabin in ways Thomas hadn't expected. The silence was no longer empty. It was companionable, comfortable. But there were things about Sarah that puzzled him. She never slept past dawn, and often he would wake in the early hours to see a light burning in the kitchen window. She jumped at unexpected sounds, her hand flying to her throat whenever a horse approached the ranch. And sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, he caught her staring out at the horizon with an expression of such profound sadness that it made his chest ache. 3 weeks into their marriage, Thomas decided it was time to bring Sarah into town for supplies and to introduce her properly to the community. Willow Creek wasn't much to look at, just a main street lined with false-fronted buildings and enough businesses to serve the scattered ranches and mining claims in the area. But it was civilization, and Thomas thought Sarah might enjoy the company of other women. The reaction was not what he'd expected. As they walked down the main street, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Women gathered in small groups, whispering behind their hands, while their eyes followed Sarah's every movement. Men tipped their hats politely enough, but Thomas noticed the way their gazes lingered, as if they were trying to place her face. At the general store, Mrs. Henderson, the shopkeeper's wife, was unusually chatty. "Such a lovely bride you found yourself, Thomas," she said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Tell me, dear, where did you say you were from back east?" Sarah's hand tightened on Thomas's arm. "Pennsylvania," she said quietly. "Pennsylvania? My, that's a long way to travel. What part? I have a sister in Philadelphia." "A small town," Sarah replied. "You wouldn't know it." Mrs. Henderson's smile became strained. "Oh, I'm sure I would. I pride myself on knowing geography. What was the name?" Thomas felt Sarah's grip on his arm become almost painful. "We should be getting back," he said quickly. "Lot of work to do before dark." As they loaded their supplies into the wagon, Thomas noticed Sheriff Bill Morrison approaching. Bill had been Thomas's friend since they'd both arrived in the territory as young men, and his expression was troubled. "Thomas," Bill said, touching the brim of his hat. "Ma'am." He nodded to Sarah, who had gone very still beside the wagon. "Might I have a word?" Thomas glanced at Sarah, who was staring at the sheriff with an expression he couldn't quite read. Fear, certainly, but something else too. Recognition, perhaps. "What's on your mind, Bill?" The sheriff's weathered face was grim. "Had some interesting visitors yesterday. Federal marshals, asking questions about newcomers to the area. Seems they're looking for someone." His eyes flicked to Sarah, who had gone pale as winter snow. Someone who might have reason to start over with a new name. Thomas felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest whoever they're looking for might be dangerous. Bill's hand rested casually on his gun belt, but Thomas noticed the gesture wasn't casual at all. The kind that suggests this person might have killed someone back east. Sarah made a small sound, barely audible, but both men heard it. Thomas turned to look at his wife, really look at her, and saw something in her green eyes that made his blood run cold. It wasn't fear anymore. It was resignation. "Sarah," he said quietly. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, the quiet, submissive woman he'd married was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely, someone with steel in her spine and fire in her gaze. "My name," she said, her voice no longer a whisper, "is not Sarah Whitmore." The words hung in the desert air like smoke from a gunshot. Thomas felt his world crumbling around him. Everything he thought he knew about his wife dissolving like morning mist. Sheriff Morrison's hand moved closer to his weapon, and several townspeople had stopped to watch the drama unfolding in front of the general store. "Then what is your name?" Thomas asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Sarah straightened her shoulders, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked him directly in the eye. "My name is Catherine Blackwood, and yes, Sheriff, I did kill someone back east, but not for the reasons you think." The sheriff stepped forward, his hand now resting on his gun. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." "No." Thomas moved between them, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. "Not until I hear what she has to say." "Thomas, this isn't your fight," Bill warned. "She's my wife. That makes it my fight." Thomas turned back to Catherine, because that's who she was now, not the quiet Sarah he'd thought he'd married. "Tell me what happened." Catherine looked around at the growing crowd of onlookers, then back at Thomas. "Not here. If you want the truth, it needs to be somewhere private." Sheriff Morrison shook his head. "I can't let her leave town, Thomas. Those marshals will be back, and if I don't have her in custody—" "Give me until morning," Thomas said. "One night to hear her story. Then, if she's willing, she'll come with you peacefully." Bill studied his friend's face, then looked at Catherine. "You give me your word you won't run?" Catherine nodded. "I'm tired of running, Sheriff. I've been tired of it for a very long time." The ride back to the ranch was conducted in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of two people learning to live together. This was the heavy silence of secrets about to be revealed, of a life about to be turned upside down. Thomas's mind raced as the wagon wheels turned. Who was this woman he'd married? What had she done? And why, despite everything, did he find himself wanting to protect her rather than turn her over to the law? When they reached the ranch, Catherine went immediately to the bedroom and returned with a small leather satchel Thomas had never seen before. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at him with those green eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of sorrow. "Before I tell you anything," she said, I need you to understand that everything I did to survive. And everything I've been since I came here, the woman you married, that's who I really am. The other person, Catherine Blackwood, she was someone I had to become to stay alive. Thomas poured himself a whiskey and offered her one, which she declined. Start from the beginning. Catherine sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap in that familiar gesture he'd come to associate with his quiet bride. I was born Catherine Elizabeth Morrison in a small town outside Pittsburgh. My father owned a steel mill, and we were what you might call comfortable. I was educated, sheltered, everything a proper young lady should be. She paused, staring out the window at the desert landscape that had become her refuge. When I was 22, my father arranged a marriage for me. Harold Blackwood was a business associate, a man with connections and money. He was also 45 years old and had buried 2 wives already. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. What happened to them? Officially, one died in childbirth, the other from consumption. But Harold's servants whispered different stories. Stories about bruises that couldn't be explained, about screams in the night, about women who grew thinner and more frightened with each passing month. Catherine opened the leather satchel and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. I kept a record, she said quietly. From the very first night of our marriage, I wrote down everything he did to me. Every blow, every threat, every time She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Thomas reached across the table and covered her hand with his. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Her voice was stronger now, more determined. You need to understand what kind of man Harold Blackwood was. He didn't just hit me, Thomas. He broke my ribs, blackened my eyes, split my lips so many times I have a permanent scar. She touched her lower lip, and Thomas saw the faint white line he'd noticed but never questioned. For 3 years, I endured it. I told myself it would get better, that if I could just be the perfect wife, he would stop. But it only got worse. He began talking about wanting children, about how his previous wives had failed him in that regard. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that if I gave him a child, he would kill me just like he'd killed the others. Catherine opened the journal and showed Thomas pages covered in her neat handwriting, documenting dates, injuries, and incidents in clinical detail. I started planning my escape. I saved money, a few coins at a time. I studied train schedules and stagecoach routes, and I waited for my opportunity. What happened? Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. Harold came home drunk one night, drunker than usual. He was angry about some business deal that had gone wrong, and he decided to take it out on me. But this time was different. This time, he had a knife. Catherine's voice remained steady, but Thomas could see her hands trembling. He said he was going to carve his initials into my face, so that everyone would know I belonged to him. He said if I couldn't give him children, at least I could serve as a warning to other women about what happened when they disappointed their husbands. Thomas felt sick. Jesus, Catherine, I fought back. For the first time in 3 years of marriage, I fought back. We struggled, and the knife, it ended up in his chest instead of my face. She looked up at Thomas, her green eyes blazing with a mixture of defiance and pain. I watched him die, Thomas. I watched the life leave his eyes, and I felt nothing but relief. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant lowing of cattle. Thomas stared at this woman he'd thought he knew, trying to reconcile the quiet, submissive Sarah with the fierce survivor sitting across from him. The servants found his body the next morning, Catherine continued. I was gone by then, on the first train heading west. I had enough money to get as far as Kansas City, where I heard about the matrimonial agencies. I thought if I could find a husband on the frontier, somewhere far from Pittsburgh and Harold's family, I could start over. Why didn't you go to the law? If he was beating you? Catherine laughed, but there was no humor in it. Harold Blackwood was a respected businessman, Thomas, a pillar of the community. I was just his wife. Who do you think they would have believed? Besides, I had no proof of what he'd done to me. Bruises heal, bones mend. But his family had money and influence, and they wanted someone to pay for his death. Thomas drained his whiskey glass and poured another. So you became Sarah Whitmore. I bought the identity from a woman in Kansas City whose daughter had died of fever. Sarah Whitmore was real, but she was dead. I took her name, her papers, and her chance at a new life. Catherine closed the journal and placed it back in the satchel. I never meant to deceive you, Thomas. I just wanted to be someone else. Someone who hadn't killed her husband. Someone who could be a good wife to a good man. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the land he'd worked so hard to build. Everything he thought he knew about his life had changed in the space of an hour. His quiet, submissive wife was actually a fugitive from justice, a woman who had killed a man with her own hands. But as he stood there, watching the sun set over the desert, Thomas realized something that surprised him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even particularly shocked. What he felt was a deep, burning rage at the man who had hurt Catherine so badly that she'd felt murder was her only escape. Thomas, Catherine's voice was small, uncertain. Say something, please. He turned back to face her and saw the woman he'd fallen in love with over the past month. Not Sarah Whitmore, the fictional bride from the matrimonial agency, but Catherine, the survivor who had endured hell and emerged strong enough to build a new life. I have something to tell you too, he said quietly. Catherine looked up at him, confusion in her green eyes. My name isn't Thomas McKenna. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Catherine stared at him, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't quite process what he'd just said. What? Thomas sat back down across from her, his hands clasped tightly together. My real name is James Thomas McKenna. I was a Texas Ranger for 8 years before I came to Arizona Territory. Catherine's eyes widened. A lawman. Was a lawman. I quit the Rangers and came here to start over, just like you did. They'd been having trouble with a gang of outlaws, cattle rustlers mostly, but they'd started robbing banks and killing anyone who got in their way. He paused, pouring himself another whiskey. The Rangers sent me and my partner, a man named David Crenshaw, to clean up the situation. We tracked the gang to their hideout in the hills outside town. There were 6 of them, and we knew we were outnumbered, but we also knew they had to be stopped. Catherine leaned forward, sensing there was more to the story. We waited until dawn, when they'd be sleeping off a night of drinking. The plan was simple. Surround the cabin, call for their surrender, and if they refused, take them by force. But something went wrong. Thomas's voice grew heavy with old pain. David was young, eager to prove himself. When we called for the outlaws to come out, one of them started shooting. David charged the cabin instead of waiting for backup like we'd planned. He was cut down before he made it halfway across the clearing. I'm sorry, Catherine said softly. I went after them then, not as a ranger, not as a lawman doing his duty, but as a man who just watched his friend die. I killed all 6 of them, Catherine. Not in a fair fight, not in self-defense. I hunted them down like animals and executed them one by one. Catherine reached across the table and took his hand. They were killers. They murdered your partner. That's what I told myself. That's what I told the other Rangers when they arrived. But the truth is, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed watching them beg, enjoyed the fear in their eyes when they realized they were going to die. And that scared me more than anything else I'd ever experienced. Thomas looked up at Catherine, his blue eyes haunted. I turned in my badge the next day and headed west. I've been running from what I did, from what I became that day ever since. They sat in silence for a while, two people who had found each other across the vast expanse of the frontier, both carrying secrets that could destroy them. Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds skittering across the yard. "So what do we do now?" Catherine asked finally. Before Thomas could answer, they heard the sound of horses approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. Thomas went to the window and peered out into the gathering darkness. "Riders coming," he said grimly. "Looks like Sheriff Morrison, and he's not alone." Catherine stood up, her face pale but determined. "The federal marshals." Thomas nodded. "Probably." Catherine moved toward the bedroom, but Thomas caught her arm. "Where are you going?" "To get my things. If I'm going to face this, I want to do it with dignity." "Catherine, wait." Thomas pulled her close. And for the first time since their wedding night, he kissed her. It was a desperate kiss, full of all the things they hadn't had time to say to each other. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I love you," he said simply. "Not Sarah Whitmore, not the woman I thought I married. You, Catherine, the woman who survived hell and came out stronger." Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks. "I love you too, and I'm sorry I brought this trouble to your door." "Our door," Thomas corrected. "We're married, remember? For better or worse." The sound of horses grew louder, and they could hear voices calling out. Thomas went to his gun cabinet and pulled out his rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. "What are you doing?" Catherine asked. "What any husband would do, protecting his wife." Catherine grabbed his arm. "Thomas, no! I won't have you throw your life away for me. I've caused enough death, and I won't let them take you without a fight." The horses stopped outside, and they heard Sheriff Morrison's voice calling out, "Thomas, we need to talk." Thomas opened the door, but kept the rifle in his hands. Sheriff Morrison stood on the porch with two men Thomas didn't recognize. They wore the long coats and serious expressions of federal lawmen, and both had their hands resting on their weapons. "Evening, Bill," Thomas said calmly. "Thomas, these are Deputy Marshals Harrison and Cole. They've come a long way to find Mrs. Blackwood." One of the marshals, a tall man with graying hair and cold eyes, stepped forward. "Mr. McKenna, we have a warrant for the arrest of Catherine Elizabeth Blackwood for the murder of Harold Blackwood in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We know she's here. Is that so?" Thomas kept his voice level. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the second marshal said. "We just want to take her back to face trial. No one else has to get hurt." Thomas was about to respond when Catherine appeared beside him. She had changed into her traveling dress and carried a small bag. Her hair was pinned back neatly, and she looked every inch the lady she had been raised to be. "Gentlemen," she said calmly, "I am Catherine Blackwood." The marshals exchanged glances. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for the murder of Harold Blackwood. You have the right to—" "I killed him," Catherine said, cutting him off. "I stabbed my husband in the chest with his own knife, and I watched him die. But before you take me back to hang for it, I think you should know the whole story. Marshal Harrison frowned. "Ma'am, anything you say can be used against you in court. I'm aware of that." Catherine stepped forward, and Thomas saw the steel in her spine that had allowed her to survive 3 years of hell. "But I think you should also know that Harold Blackwood was a murderer himself. He killed his first 2 wives, and he was planning to kill me." "That's a serious accusation," Marshal Cole said. "It's the truth." Catherine opened her bag and pulled out the leather journal. "I documented everything. Every beating, every threat, every time he told me how he'd killed the others and made it look like natural causes." She handed the journal to Marshal Harrison, who opened it and began reading. His expression grew increasingly grim as he turned the pages. "This is detailed," he said finally. 3 years' worth of evidence," Catherine replied. "Harold Blackwood was a monster, and I was his victim long before I became his killer." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward. "If what she's saying is true, it is true," Thomas said firmly, "and I'll testify to her character. This woman is not a cold-blooded killer. She's a survivor." Marshal Harrison closed the journal and looked at his partner. They had a whispered conversation that Thomas couldn't hear. Then Harrison turned back to Catherine. "Ma'am, we still have to take you back to Pennsylvania. But this journal, it changes things. A good lawyer might be able to use this to argue self-defense." Catherine nodded. "I understand. I'm ready to face whatever comes." Thomas stepped forward. "I'm coming with her." "Thomas, no," Catherine protested. "You have a life here, a ranch." "I have a wife," Thomas said firmly, "and where she goes, I go." Sheriff Morrison looked uncomfortable. "Thomas, you sure about this? Once you leave Arizona territory, there's no guarantee you'll be coming back." Thomas looked at Catherine, at this remarkable woman who had endured so much and still found the strength to love again. "I'm sure." The next morning, as the sun rose over the desert, Thomas loaded their belongings into a wagon. He'd made arrangements with his neighbor to look after the ranch and the cattle, though he wasn't sure when or if he'd be back to reclaim them. Catherine sat beside him on the wagon seat, her hands folded in her lap in that familiar gesture. But she wasn't the quiet, submissive Sarah Whitmore anymore. She was Catherine Blackwood, and she was going back to face her past with her head held high. "Are you afraid?" Thomas asked as they followed the marshals toward town. Catherine considered the question. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also relieved. I'm tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder. Whatever happens in Pennsylvania, at least it will be over." Thomas reached over and took her hand. "We'll face it together." "Together," Catherine agreed. As they rode toward an uncertain future, Thomas reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. He'd come to Arizona territory to escape his past, to bury the violent man he'd become after David's death. Instead, he'd found a woman who understood violence, who had been forced to embrace it to survive. Maybe that's what love was on the frontier, he thought. Not the romantic notions of Eastern novels, but 2 damaged people finding strength in each other, finding a way to build something good from the wreckage of their pasts. The trial in Pittsburgh lasted 3 weeks. Catherine's journal proved to be devastating evidence of Harold Blackwood's cruelty. And when combined with testimony from former servants who had been too frightened to speak up before, it painted a picture of systematic abuse that shocked even the hardened courtroom observers. The prosecution argued that Catherine could have left, could have sought help, could have done anything other than murder. But Catherine's lawyer, a young man named Samuel Morrison, who reminded Thomas of his dead partner David, argued passionately that she had been trapped by a system that offered women no protection from violent husbands. Catherine Blackwood did not commit murder, he told the jury in his closing argument. She committed an act of survival against a man who had already killed twice and was planning to kill again. She is not a criminal, she is a hero who saved her own life and possibly the lives of future victims. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered their verdict. Not guilty by reason of self-defense. Catherine collapsed into Thomas's arms, sobbing with relief. Around them, the courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Harold Blackwood's family stormed out, their faces twisted with rage, but Catherine was free. That night in their hotel room, Thomas held his wife as she cried tears of relief and exhaustion. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "It's finally over." "What do we do now?" Catherine asked. "Do we go back to Arizona?" Thomas considered the question. "Do you want to go back?" Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "I loved our life there, the peace, the quiet, the feeling that we could be anyone we wanted to be. But I'm not sure I can go back to being Sarah Whitmore. That woman was born out of fear and desperation. I want to be Catherine McKenna now, your wife, the woman who faced her past and survived." Thomas smiled and kissed the top of her head. "Then that's who you'll be." They returned to Arizona Territory 6 months later, but not to the same ranch. Thomas had sold his spread and used the money to buy land further north, near Flagstaff, where the air was cooler and the mountains provided a dramatic backdrop to their new life. Catherine proved to be everything Thomas had hoped for in a wife. But more than that, she was his partner in every sense of the word. She helped him build their new ranch, worked alongside him during cattle drives, and even learned to shoot well enough to defend their home when he was away. The quiet, submissive woman who had stepped off the train in Willow Creek was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, more confident, more alive. Catherine McKenna was a force to be reckoned with, and Thomas loved every fierce, independent inch of her. On their first wedding anniversary, they stood on the porch of their new home, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Catherine leaned against Thomas's chest, her head resting on his shoulder. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Marrying a woman with such a complicated past?" Thomas tightened his arms around her. "Never. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Catherine McKenna. You saved me just as much as I saved you." "How did I save you?" "You showed me that the past doesn't have to define us, that we can choose who we want to be, regardless of what we've done or what's been done to us. You taught me that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose imperfections complement your own." Catherine turned in his arms and kissed him, a long, sweet kiss that tasted of new beginnings and second chances. When they broke apart, she smiled up at him with those green eyes that had first captured his attention. "I love you, James Thomas McKenna," she said, using his full name for the first time. "And I love you, Catherine Elizabeth McKenna," he replied. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, they went inside their home, ready to face whatever the future might bring. They had learned that love on the frontier wasn't easy, but it was real, forged in the crucible of hardship and tempered by the strength it took to survive. Behind them, the desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the promise of new tomorrows and the echo of old secrets finally laid to rest. In the distance, a coyote howled, and Catherine smiled, no longer afraid of the sounds of the night. She was home.